Today, we will be discussing how the advancements in artificial intelligence, specifically OpenAI, may be changing the field of science communication. With the ability to process vast amounts of information and generate human-like text, OpenAI has the potential to revolutionize how scientific findings are shared with the general public. We will explore the potential benefits and drawbacks of using AI in science communication, and how it may impact the way we receive and understand complex scientific concepts. In particular, we will explore the potential uses and pitfalls of using OpenAI to produce educational videos such as this one, looking at a test case of what we know about cliff swallows and their adaptations to humans and their automobiles in particular. Sound interesting? I hope so. At least the artificial agent that wrote that for me thinks that it's a wonderful introduction to my talk today. Let's explore these ideas and more coming up. Well, hello there, ChatGPT, artificial agent. Write me an introduction to a video about cliff swallows, research on their evolutionary adaptations to living around humans and automobiles in particular, and include how artificial intelligence can be used to help us understand this topic. ChatGPT responds, cliff swallows are a species of birds known for their distinctive mud nest and their ability to adapt to human environments. They are often seen building their nests on cliffs, bridges, and other man-made structures, and have even been known to build their nest on the sides of buildings and underneath overpasses. In recent years, researchers have been studying the evolutionary adaptations that have allowed cliff swallows to thrive in human-made environments. This research has revealed some fascinating insights into how these birds have adapted to living around humans and automobiles in particular. One of the key ways in which cliff swallows have adapted to human environments is through their ability to avoid collisions with vehicles. This is an important skill, as their nests are often built in areas with a high volume of traffic, such as underneath overpasses or on the sides of highways. Artificial intelligence, AI, has played a crucial role in this research, with machine learning algorithms being used to analyze large amounts of data on cliff swallow behavior. By analyzing this data, researchers have been able to gain a better understanding of the mechanisms behind the cliff swallow's ability to avoid collisions with vehicles and to identify potential areas of future study or further study. In this video, we will explore the latest research on cliff swallows and their evolutionary adaptations to living around humans and automobiles. We will also discuss how AI has been used to help researchers gain a deeper understanding of these fascinating birds. Okay, no, that's not actually what we're here to talk about, that specific dialogue there. What that is what ChatGPT, an artificial intelligence writing agent, has suggested given the prompt that I read to you. Okay, it's me. It's really me. Yes, Joel Duff. I'm here, I'm speaking, and the words that are coming out of my mouth now are words are just off the top of my head. I'm not looking at a script. I'm not reading something, unlike what I've been doing up to this point. Even my introduction that over my cover slide was written by ChatGPT, an artificial intelligence agent. Then I read you a prompt, and I read you what potentially could be the introduction to a discussion about cliff swallows, automobiles, natural selection, and artificial intelligence. But that's not actually what we're here to talk about. We're going to talk about elements of all those things, but the cliff swallows, evolutionary biology, and automobiles are simply a vehicle, for me to discuss the relative merits, pros and cons of this ChatGPT thing, which has become very popular in recent days. I want to look at this strange new world we're entering into, although really it's been around for a while and it's already infused itself into a number of different aspects of society without maybe people realizing it. But now it's becoming a little bit more in our face, and as educators, many educators are very concerned about how students and others will write and use agents such as this to do their homework, say. that got me to looking into ChatGPT, and I fed into the dialogue box a number of questions that I asked my students on homework assignments, and I think about like what are the types of responses that I would expect to get from my questions, and I've been looking at the responses that ChatGPT provides, and I have to admit, for general knowledge things, it writes amazing responses for which I would probably give 100% to students, thinking that they had written those responses and would congratulate them for understanding the material. I'm not going to show you those. I maybe at another time I'll discuss the whole homework and from an educator point of view what we should be thinking about this ChatGPT and maybe how we should defend ourselves. But we're not going to go down that rabbit trail today. Maybe another time. Let's just stick to one concrete example, an example in which I asked ChatGPT to come up with text to go with a potential video about swallows, automobiles, evolutionary biology. That's the video I already made. Now, I thought about this ChatGPT thing as I was making that video, but I made that video independent of ChatGPT. And now what I want to look at is what would have happened if I had used ChatGPT and not actually known the literature, actually gone into the scientific literature and looked for myself to see what the evidence is, all right? What kind of evidence has been collected and how has it been interpreted? So what if I just trusted my artificial agent to provide me the answers to a generic question, are swallows adapting to this man-made environment? Specifically, are swallows adapting to the presence of automobiles in their environment? All right, let's take a look at that. Before I do, I want you to note the text on this slide. Every image in this video was produced or created by Dream Artificial Intelligence by Wombo. So these are all another artificial agent that has produced images for me. And those images were based on 2 prompts. One of them was the words artificial intelligence and writing. That created this image. The other one was just Cliff Sparrow. Draw me a Cliff Sparrow in the style of, and I gave it several different styles to do. All right, so everything you're seeing is generated that way. So before we continue, you might ask the question, and we should address the question, well, what is this OpenAI thing you're talking about? This artificial intelligence agent, this ChatGPT interface. Well, let's just ask ChatGPT, what exactly are you? So here's my prompt. What is OpenAI? I asked OpenAI. And here was its response. OpenAI is a leading artificial intelligence research institute that is dedicated to advancing the field of AI and developing new technologies and techniques for building intelligent systems. OpenAI produces its results through a combination of cutting-edge research and the development of powerful machine learning algorithms and systems. One of the key ways that OpenAI produces its results is through the development of large language models, such as GPT-3, which are trained on vast amounts of text data in order to generate high-quality text in response to prompts and questions. These models use a type of machine learning called deep learning, which involves the use of neural networks that are designed to mimic the structure and function of the human brain. Another key way that OpenAI produces its results is through the development of reinforcement learning algorithms, which are used to train agents to solve complex problems and tasks in a variety of environments. These algorithms use a trial and error approach in which agents learn from its experiences and gradually improves its performance over time. Now, if you're like me and you've read this response and heard this response and you still are asking, what exactly is OpenAI? I don't blame you. And I'm not actually here to explain the ins and outs of how it works, especially since I've listened to programs about how it works in which it was clear that really no one really fully understands how it works. What we're here to do is to look at the responses that AI provides to a particular prompt and to ask ourselves, what's the quality of the responses? And what should we be concerned about with those responses? And what is especially, I guess, noteworthy or amazing about some of these responses? So the particular question that we're going to be asking here, ChatGPT, has to do with swallows and automobiles, and whether swallows are evolving to avoid automobiles. And this came up because I had, and the reason we're asking that question is because I've just finished looking at a whole bunch of papers on this particular topic, including this primary one, which is a short article from 2013, Where Has All the Roadkill Gone? And in this article, what they note, what the authors Charles and Mary Brown note, is that they have been watching swallows, recording swallows, observing swallows for 30 years in an area of Nebraska. And during that time, they noticed that there was fewer and fewer and fewer roadkill. They'd actually been collecting roadkill for 30 years. And there was a dramatic decrease in the amount of roadkill. At the same time, there was a observed increase in the total population size of swallows in that particular area, including increased populations in overpasses where these birds are making their nests and raising their young. And so that raised the obvious question, where has all the roadkill gone? And what is one possible hypothesis for where the roadkill has gone? There aren't as many roadkill because the birds are somehow avoiding automobiles. And so that raises the specter that these birds are evolving, right? They are changing something about their behavior or physical attributes in order to avoid being killed by automobiles. So, very intriguing article. And if you want to learn a lot more about that, you can watch my previous video on swallows and are they evolving to avoid automobiles. But we want to look at how ChatGPT responds. And I was thinking, like, what would happen if I were to use ChatGPT to essentially investigate this topic, having never read these articles? What if I didn't know anything about it? What if somebody had just asked me that question? How are swallows maybe evolving to avoid automobiles? I could go to ChatGPT, just like you would go to a Google search engine. You would type maybe that question in. Now, if you typed it in Google, what would you get? You'd get a whole bunch of different links to different places that somehow maybe had something to do with either swallows or automobiles and maybe some article, and then you'd have to read that article and maybe find something out. ChatGPT is not going to take you anywhere. It's going to just lay out a potential answer to your question. So let's look at the first response. Now, the first response is, this is exactly what it wrote to me in response to my prompt. I haven't changed a word of this. It is not clear whether cliff swallows are evolving to avoid automobiles, as this is a complex and ongoing process that is influenced by many factors. Let's face it, that's a pretty generic first line that I think anybody could write and is not surprising, right? Given that it is a complex question, and so you're just kind of hedging, right? It's a very vague response. However, it is possible that cliff swallows are adapting to the presence of automobiles in the environment in a number of ways. So I have asked it a specific question, so it's going to make an attempt to provide some ways in which they may be evolving. So what are those ways? One possible way in which cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles is by changing their behavior. For example, cliff swallows may be learning to avoid flying near roads and highways where they're more likely to encounter automobiles. This could involve changing their migration patterns, their foraging behavior, or their nesting habits, right? That's a pretty astute answer, right? That certainly would be something I would expect my students to respond and say, like, that's a possibility. That's something they would hypothesize. Secondly, another way in which cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles is by changing their physical characteristics. For example, cliff swallows may be developing longer wings or more agile flight patterns, which would allow them to avoid collisions with automobiles more easily. And the corollary to that is it is possible that cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles through changes in their genetics, which I would argue is actually part of the second answer as well, and even part of the first answer as well, because changing your behavior also probably likely includes some genetic factors as well. For example, certain genetic variations may provide cliff swallows with an advantage in avoiding automobiles, and these variations may become more common over time. That's a wonderful description of natural selection, that last line, right? The birds that aren't killed by automobiles because they have characteristics that allow them to avoid the automobiles. Maybe they have longer or shorter wing lengths, or they have different behaviors, and the behaviors are based on their genetics. Those variations become more common in time, become more common over time. Why? Because they survived, they didn't get killed, and so they are more likely to have offspring, and therefore pass those particular variants of their biology to the next generation. All of this response is quite good. It provides us with 2 or 3 hypotheses for how cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles. And if I had asked my students this question, and I would be perfectly happy with these types of responses. Okay, this is the first response. Let's look at the second response. The thing about ChatGPT is that you can ask it a question. You can dialogue with it, as they call it. And you can prompt them to respond to things. But then once they provide a response, or I should say it provides a response, you can ask it, let's do it again, all right? Give me a response, right? Ask the very same thing again. So here is the second response. Cliff swallows, and then there's the scientific notation, right? The Latin name. So that's a nice addition. May be evolving to avoid automobiles, according to a recent study by researchers at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Very interesting. This one started out with a very vague, it's not clear whether they're evolving. And this is a really complex process that includes many factors. This time we're going to get more specific. Cliff swallows may be evolving, and there's a recent study by some folks at the University of Nebraska which suggests that might be the case. The study found that cliff swallows that live near highways are more likely to have long wings and shorter tails than those that live in more rural areas, which may help them avoid collisions with vehicles. We're getting quite specific now in the second response. The researchers conducted the study by examining the wing and tail measurements of more than 1,000 cliff swallows from across the United States. They found that birds living near highways were more likely to have longer wings and shorter tails than those living in more rural areas. The researchers believe that this difference in wing and tail measurements may be due to natural selection, as birds with longer wings and shorter tails may be better able to avoid collisions with vehicles, and thus are more likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, this may lead to a change in the overall appearance of cliff swallows living near highways, as more and more individuals with longer wings and shorter tails are born into the population. Once again, this last paragraph is a really nice summary of how natural selection functions, and an application of natural selection to the question of how might these cliff swallows be adapting to the presence of automobiles. The problem with the second response is when the OpenAI attempted to provide a more specific response, the more specific response sounds great. It sounds like it's providing much more information, but the information's all wrong. All right, it's not all wrong. It's mixing a lot of good ideas, but it's mixing them together. And so although the sentence structure flows, the logic through this entire explanation flows very well and sounds great. And I'm sure that if I gave this to students who didn't know anything about cliff swallows and so forth, they would be completely convinced by this data or by this explanation. Having read the actual papers, I know there's something terribly wrong. Something has gone awry here, right? In fact, there is a group from the Nebraska. The paper I just showed you the front page of was written by authors from Nebraska and Kansas. And there are studies about automobiles and cliff swallows. I just told you there was one, and I've done another video about it. Did that study find that swallows that live near highways are more likely to have longer wings and shorter tails? No. They found the opposite, at least with respect to wings. And they weren't looking at birds that lived in rural areas versus near highways. And so there's something, I knew right away, there's something wrong here. Now, I've looked at a bunch of other literature and I asked myself, are there other papers that might have dealt, with other topics similar to this? So look at the second paragraph. The researchers conducted the study, as if there is like one study or this specific study. However, you notice no reference. OpenAI doesn't provide references because it's not really going into the internet, reading some particular paper and then pulling out the information from that paper and copying it for you and saying like, here's where I got this. It's read lots of literature and then it essentially doesn't know where it got any of it. It's chopped it up into little pieces of information. And what it's doing is it's compiling ideas. All right, this is my interpretation of what it's doing based on things I've heard, and I'm probably a little bit off here, but the way, just by looking at these responses, I've kind of have a sense for what's happening here. It's taken a bunch of information and learned a bunch of things about cliff swallows, about evolutionary theory, about a variety of different studies that look at wing length and tails and so forth, and what it would mean if you have longer tails or shorter tails. How would that affect how organisms might live in the environment? And it's taken all this information and then it's compiled its own novel writing, right? Its own novel response. The problem with novelty in this case is that it's disconnected the actual information from a specific circumstance. And it's mixed different papers together. It's mixed the data from one paper with the conclusions of another without really knowing that. So let me show you how that is. I don't know of a paper that there are many papers that looked at over thousands of cliff swallows. But I don't know of any paper that I've been able to find that looked at birds that live near the highway versus ones that were in rural areas and found that they had longer wings. I know of a bunch of papers that looked at the climate, right, effects on bird wing length and tail length. So let me show you. Oh, first of all, I didn't show you the data from the original paper. So what Charles and Mary Brown found, right, this is the Nebraska study in 2013. They have watched or recorded cliff swallow nests for 30 years and driven the same roads for 30 years and collected roadkill. They found that roadkill has gone way down over those 30 years, whereas the population has increased. It's more than doubled in the same area. And then most importantly, for the discussion we're going to have here, they found that the roadkill were more likely to have longer wings. And roadkill have longer wings over time, whereas the entire population, the general population, the overall average for the population has gone down. Their wings have gotten smaller over time. What they conclude is that in this area of Nebraska, one of the potential influences on wingspan is birds trying to avoid trucks and cars. And what happens is the ones with the longer wings are the ones that are unable to get themselves up off the ground and maneuver quick enough to get out of the way of vehicles, and therefore are taken out of the population. And as they're taken out of the population, the overall genetics of the population has shifted toward more and more with smaller wings because those are the survivors and they then have more offspring that have shorter wings. And of course, once in a while, they're going to genetically recombine to form longer wings as well, but those ones are going to be more susceptible to being killed. And so that is directional selection pushing the population to become shorter winged over time. All right, that was the conclusion of this particular paper, that it was long-winged birds that had a disadvantage. That is not what is said here. They said birds with longer wings might be better able to avoid collisions with vehicles. That's the opposite conclusion. So if this particular response was based on the paper I'm showing you, they've misinterpreted it, right? The artificial intelligence is reporting it the opposite way. But I don't think it's actually using that paper. I think it's using a combination of many different papers. I think it's looking partly at this paper from 1998. It may have picked up pieces from this, where there's intense natural selection on body size and wing and tail, because it mentions wings and tails in its response. And that asymmetry is correlated with the response to climate, not response with being rural or near a highway or anything like that. response to climate. And these are the same authors, all right? Again, Charles and Mary Brown. And what they've done here is they have shown that extreme climatic events. So in a year in which there is some extreme climate, that knocks out 20 or 25% of the population. Doesn't just knock them out randomly. There are some individuals more likely to die than others. And they happen to, in this case, it happens to be that the ones with the longer wingspan are better survivors than the ones with shorter wingspan. And so some of the population actually gets longer wingspan over time. Oh, I don't know if I'm remembering that right. It kind of doesn't matter either way. I can't remember if it gets smaller or larger, but it doesn't matter. The point is that this paper was about climate being the natural selector and having an influence on certain populations of cliff swallows, not rural versus near a highway. And here's another paper yet again. I mean, there's bunches of papers on cliff swallows and swallows in general and birds and how their morphology, their shape of their wings and so forth, and their total body mass is affected by climatic changes. So what we saw here was more than 1,000 cliff swallows in this study of wing and tail measurements. That study did have more than 1,000 swallows, and they were looking at wing and tail measurements, but there was no mention in that paper about highways, okay, and looking at rural areas and trying to tie this into automobiles. Now, of course, I gave it a prompt to try to explain automobiles, and so it's taken this evidence from another paper that was dealing with climate, I think, and it's saying, look, well, we can apply that same logic to automobiles, right? And we'll, I know that automobiles are associated with highways, so we got to talk about highways here. You see how it's composing something that's logical, but it's not composing it based on any cohesive study that's been done and being consistent with the data that's out there in the world. All right, but it gets a lot better than this. This is only the second. We're going to do 4 responses. We're going to ask this thing to answer the question 4 times. Here's response number 3. Okay, response number 3. It is not clear how cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles. As is, there is no scientific evidence to support this idea. The previous one suggested there is scientific evidence to support this idea. And then I've shown you a paper which has suggested that that changes in wing length is potentially a direct result of being smashed by automobiles. So the automobile is the selective agent in that case in the environment. It's the environmental challenge to birds, and birds are overcoming the challenge by changing themselves, all right, through population effects. Now, here's where I think it starts to really get kind of interesting. Evolution is a slow and gradual process, and it takes place over many generations. It is unlikely that cliff swallows or any other species would be able to evolve quickly enough to avoid a relatively new threat such as automobiles. I actually think this is a fantastic response. It takes the general idea, right, which you would get if you looked at lots of literature, that how organisms adapt to the environment is going to be a fairly lengthy process for any species. It's going to require, you can't just change your alleles overnight. And so you're gradually selecting for characteristics, but that could take hundreds of generations. Hundreds of generations is a long time when you consider automobiles just show up and the environment changes really quickly. We've changed the environment very quickly. And there's a lot of discussion about how can organisms adapt to this human-changed world? And generally, the answer is probably not fast enough in order to avoid extinction for many of them, right? But as we've seen, there is data that some organisms do actually adapt over just a few generations, right? Over 30 years, there's some adaptation that is happening, helping to avoid automobiles. But this is perfectly reasonable to suggest as a general principle. Again, as a undergraduate taking an evolutionary biology class, it would not be unreasonable to say, like, okay, you're asking me how something can adapt to this thing happening right now. Well, my first answer is that it takes a long time for organisms to adapt, so I don't expect to necessarily see this over just 1 or 2 generations. All right. And so now look how the writing goes after this. So that's an interesting starting point. And then it says, that being said, right, it is possible that cliff swallows, like other animals, are adapting to the presence of automobiles in their environment in other ways. For example, they may be changing their behavior or habitat use in order to avoid collisions with cars. And one problem I have with that is that's a very reasonable sounding response. One problem I have with that is actually changing their environment and behavior also can involve changing their genetics over time as well. But organisms also have the ability to adapt even at an individual population level within a generation by learning in their environment. And I don't have time to go into it, but that other paper actually talks about how these birds didn't learn to avoid, like individuals didn't learn by watching their parents or something how to avoid being hit by cars. And there's ways to show that that's not the case. For example, cliff swallows may be avoiding roads and highways where there is a high density of traffic, and instead choosing to build their nests in areas where there is less traffic. All right, that's a hypothesis, right? And that's what I've asked for. What are some ways that there's less roadkill? There's less roadkill because they're looking and they're like, well, there's a lot of cars over there. I'm going to build my nest over here where there's less traffic. And they've learned to do that. And so they've observed the world. They've observed their friends being killed, and we're just going to move over here, and we're not going to be roadkill as often. They may be also changing flight patterns of their nesting behavior in order to reduce their exposure to cars. Now, the actual data says that the amount of traffic has stayed about the same for 30 years, but the number of nests have increased a lot in those areas where those roads are. And so the actual real world data is that that this would be an explanation for why they're not being struck by cars anymore. They haven't changed their behavior in that way because we have observational evidence that suggests so. So now I can't blame the artificial intelligence agent for not knowing that, although it's there in the literature, right? Still, this response is decent because it's giving general principles. It's drawing upon general principles. And that's the one thing I've noticed here is that this thing is very good at drawing general conclusions and drawing together things that are consensus views and of things and be able to put them together into a very cohesive, fairly logical sentence structure, right? That explains things fairly well. So that's the third response. Not as specific as the second response, but we're going with this more, hey, and you notice they start with an idea. Evolution is a slow and gradual process, and they build this logic structure. Very nice. The fourth response. Cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles as a result of the increasing number of cars on the road. This is a phenomenon known as evolutionary rescue, in which a population of animals is able to adapt to new and changing conditions in order to avoid extinction. Wow, right? All this is like 20 seconds later. I click again and I say, respond to this prompt. And now I get this particular response. Very different than the previous response, because now we're talking about actually more rapid change. Change by organisms to new and changing conditions. This is the whole idea. Evolutionary rescue is just the idea that if there is a fairly dramatic changes in the environment, such that organisms, most of them would die, and you're basically doomed to extinction if you continue as you are. You don't have a choice. You have to adapt, right? You have to cause changes to occur, or you have to experience changes that allow you to survive in that new environment. You have to adapt to that new environment. You have to rescue yourself, all right, from this dismal environment that you're now in. You used to be adapted. Now you're no longer adapted to that environment because the environment changed. And essentially that's what we are saying with cliff swallows. We're saying they're living their lives, la-di-da, and then people come along. Okay, that's fine. But then they create automobiles that drive really fast down roads where the roads have, and then they smack into insects, and the insects are lying on the road. And it's like the birds are like, whoa, free food right here. How awesome is that? And they sit on the road and pick it up, and then they get run over. Okay, so that's a new environment that they have never experienced before in the history of that species. And I'm not sure that that would be lethal to them. right? Even if it knocked out 10% of all the birds every year, they might still survive as a species. Nonetheless, that's a fairly strong pressure to say you might want to figure out how to avoid these cars, if you want to continue as a successful species. You better rescue yourself from that situation. One of the ways that cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles is by changing the locations of their nests. Historically, cliff swallows have built their nests on cliffs and other rocky outcrops. But as the number of cars on the road has increased, they have begun to build their nest on bridges and other man-made structures. This allows the swallows to avoid the dangers posed by cars, and it helps them ensure their survival. Okay, now here's the first time where OpenAI they've missed the boat on this one, because this doesn't make sense. This is not applying general principles, logic, statistics, and so forth to like making a natural, well-reasoned hypothesis. As the number of cars on the road has increased, they have begun to build their nests on bridges and other man-made structures. For one thing, why in the world? Why? Because the cars have increased, that's why you build them on bridges and there's no connection there. There's no logic to why that would be the case. In other words, you need a hypothesis to explain why that would be true. And the opposite is actually true. I mean, why increase? This has nothing to do with the increase in cars. It's just the fact that present cars are present at all. They've built their nest on bridges and man-made structures. Babbling on there. This makes no sense because the last sentence. This allows the swallows to avoid the dangers posed by cars. How would more cars and building your nests now on bridges and other man-made structures near those increasing cars help you avoid the dangers posed by cars and therefore ensure their survival? This makes no sense at all, right? So here's where that's my prompt. That's my, my homework question prompt. And student X, types in the prompt and they get this response. And they read it and they're like, oh, this sounds really sophisticated. And yes, here's a reason why they may not be avoiding these vehicles. And they hand it in to me. And I look at it, I was like, this makes no sense based on what you should know. Just on general principles, you should be able to identify there's a problem with this particular example. Whereas student Y was the one that punched in this particular prompt and they got the first response, right? And I look at the first response and like, oh, that's really nice. Those are two really well-described hypotheses that really cover the entire basis of what possible explanations there are. The second response was really specific. And I'd be like, well, that's really impressive. You really know some literature here. Unfortunately, I also know the literature and I happen to know you got all the literature wrong. Right? And I suspect something is up there. It's because like, how could you have been so wrong about this? However, the answer grammatically sounds good. And if I, as an instructor, didn't really know the literature, right? I just like, hey, this is an interesting evolutionary biology question. And I have the answer, the first response answer in my mind is like, this is what I'm looking for. That's my grading rubric, right? I'm expecting these two basic hypotheses, but I get the second response and it's quite specific. And I'd be like, well, that's really intriguing too. And I'd be tempted to probably give credit for that if I didn't know anything about the actual question, the data itself, the research itself. All right, well, let's continue. There's more to the fourth response. Another way that cliff swallows may be evolving to avoid automobiles is by changing their behavior. For example, they may be becoming more cautious and vigilant while flying near roads in order to avoid collisions with cars. But there's no evidence of this, but it is not an unreasonable hypothesis. They may also be changing the way they hunt for food in order to avoid flying over busy roads. Overall, it's likely that cliff swallows are evolving to avoid automobiles in order to survive in a world that's increasingly dominated by human activity. This is a prime example of how animals can adapt to changing conditions in order to avoid extinction. Yeah, that sounds like something a smart student would write, but doesn't necessarily know what the answer is, right? The fluff words. And that's what ChatGPT does provide for a lot of things. If you ask it for, I've asked a variety of questions, and you often get like kind of these very fluffy, generic first two sentences, and then you get a fluffy, generic, final couple sentences, sort of wrapping things up. And then in between is where your potential meat is in terms of like, here's a real response. So what's the lesson to be learned here? Wow, I really wish I had asked ChatGPT that question so that I'd have a transcript to read to you right now, because I'm just doing this at this point off the top of my head. And maybe that's kind of the point. I find this tool potentially useful, and let's face it, it's going to become reality. There's no like, this is the most horrible thing that's ever been created and it's going to destroy humanity. Well, it very well may destroy humanity, but the thing is that thinking that is not going to stop it from becoming reality, that this is something that people are going to use. And you just have to go out and read a couple of articles and hear a couple people talk about it to realize how pervasive this kind of software, this artificial intelligence programming is going to become, if it isn't already embedded in a lot of things today. But it could well supplant things like Google. I asked it for a recipe for chicken scampi in the style of Olive Garden. And what it gave to me was really a very reasonable recipe. I know because I make that particular meal quite often, and I've dabbled in a lot of different variations of that meal from different websites. So if I asked Google that question, Google would send me to a bunch of websites for chicken scampi, and I would look at them and like, I'll try that. The thing about ChatGPT is if it becomes the replacement for a search engine, then you ask that question and you get a written out description. Here's your ingredients. Here's how you do this. Put this together with this. Do this, do this, do this. Enjoy. Right? And I just print that out and I do it. I can tell you that what I saw was novel in the sense I've never seen that exact recipe before. But it's so similar to a variety of other ones that I'm sure it would make a halfway decent chicken scampi. So this is going to be our new reality. And for educators such as myself, how much are students and others going to simply use instruments like this to provide their own answers? Is this the death of writing? I can tell you, as I thought about, could I make a whole video and a whole blog post about things that I write about? It'd be easy to write a generic movie review with this. I tried that. Yes, you can write a movie review of any movie you want, and it will write you a review that sprinkles in some information about that movie and says some platitudes and maybe offers a criticism. But they're always very generic. There's still a place for people who think, and there always is going to be. I know the literature, and so I can assess this type of information. What do I think? I just wanted to provide an example for something for you to think about. Just how I have gone through my own exploration of this artificial intelligence agent. And I'm still thinking about it. I'm really seriously thinking about how or if I should use agents like this to do anything. My introduction to this particular video, I could have written something very similar to that. And that's probably along the lines of kind of what I would say as an introduction to this particular video. But instead, I asked it to write me I forget what the prompt was. Actually, I didn't write it down. But here was, today we'll be discussing how the advancements of artificial intelligence, specifically OpenAI, blah, 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 right? You should have been clued in that wasn't my writing, right? Because it was too grammatically correct to have possibly been me actually writing that out or speaking it. It was too clean. Nonetheless, it's very similar in terms of the different ideas that I would have incorporated into an introduction. And so it was very easy for me to write out 15 words and then have it spit out 150 to 200 words. And I could read through that and I could just make a couple of small changes. I didn't make any changes to this, but I could take that and I could add my own flair to it, right? I could add my own personality to it. I just read it dryly as it came out in my intro. But I could have added like my own sort of a couple different additions and my own sort of style to that. And that would have saved me a bunch of time because I didn't have to sit there and outline something and think about the points I wanted to have. It gives me like 3 points. And when I developed my video on, I was developing this video at the same time I was doing the one on the sparrows that I just recorded yesterday. And I'll admit that a little bit of the structure of that video came from a prompt that I had in which I asked it to give me a number of different hypotheses. And it gave me like a list of things. And that became part of the structure of how I made that particular video, right? So it helped me organize those thoughts. And I'm not going to call myself an expert on cliff swallows. I've only read a couple papers, but I do know generally the type of literature and the concepts that are involved in those particular papers fairly well, certainly much more than the average person does. And the fact I know something about cliff swallows themselves now puts me in a pretty exclusive group of maybe several hundred people in terms of their knowledge of cliff swallow population genetics and evolutionary biology. So that allows me to be able to use something like this instrument to write me the generic information about rather than having to go to Wikipedia or something and read, get the scientific name and get the basic information that you need to kind of introduce people to, like what is a cliff swallow? They make their nest here, they live here, they migrate, they have this kind of lifespan. To get that basic information into some kind of readable format, or even as you asked ChatGPT, is like, I want this in podcast format. Well, then it writes it in a particular style. So it takes that information, puts it in that style. And then if I take that and then modify it into my own particular, like I want to emphasize this, and I also have this as part of the way I would say it, rather than the computer saying it, or not the computer, it's the artificial intelligent agent, whatever that thing is. That potentially is useful, right? You could say that's a generic corner cutting device. But what happens when your corner cutting device becomes your crutch to writing everything, right? In which case you're not developing your own thoughts very often. You're allowing these instruments to develop your thoughts, and you're just modifying things. I think eventually you lose your ability to do the original thinking and to do the original research. I don't mind this case of the sparrows. It's like, okay, that gave me a couple paragraphs to get started. This thing can't discuss the actual research, the research article. That is pretty clear to me. And I hope I demonstrated to you here that although it may have all little bits and pieces of all those different papers in its head and in its knowledge base, when it tries to extract all the information as it's drawing and making paragraphs and trying to draw on all these ideas in the world of these different scientific theorems, and then put them together to make sensical, logical ideas, they're losing a tremendous amount of information about the specifics that are tied to each other in that particular paper. These data were generated and analyzed to answer a specific question. You can't take this particular data and try to apply it to something else for which that data wasn't collected for. All right, I don't know if that makes sense, but there's going to be problems when you mix and match, right, between these different papers. Now, will the artificial intelligent agent get better? That's the real interesting question, is whether it will learn from all these types of mistakes. And when I ask it 2 years from now, will it really understand that literature better and know the information and how to parse it together to logically connect 3 different papers and draw appropriate conclusions from multiple papers that don't contradict each other? That's going to be both fascinating, amazing, but also admittedly a little bit scary. So I feel like I'm forgetting something else I was going to say, which is I should have written down more notes, right? I should have notes up in front of me that guide me through this. But I do know one thing. Let's think about what I could do. I said earlier that I wouldn't talk about this, but now of course I am. What should I do as an instructor? Right? If this had been my prompt, my question to the class in an assignment, especially a take-home assignment, and then I see these different responses. And the thing about ChatGPT is that it gives a different response every time. And so it's not like I can see like, oh, these 5 students all gave the same response. Well, they're obviously cheating, right? They obviously copied off each other. No, this thing provides a unique response each time for which I would have difficulty. Apparently there are some tools to help you identify it's written by an artificial agent, but nonetheless, on the surface of it, I would have difficulty saying, oh, you didn't write that, right? So what could I do instead? Well, one, I think, interesting idea, and this isn't novel to me, would be to go back and say, look, I'm going to give you this prompt, and I'm actually going to tell you, you have to use the artificial writing agent. You have to ask this thing to develop hypotheses or answer these particular questions and write a little mini essay. But what your responsibility is you need to tell me how well it did its job, right? You need to look at answer number 2, and you need to be able to say, here's what's wrong with answer number 2. I went and I looked up some papers, and when I looked them up, I found out that it had this wrong. It connected these dots incorrectly. It made this particular inference, which wasn't actually found in that particular paper, but was found somewhere else. In other words, you have to do the heavy lifting of actually testing, taking the artificial agent to task. Or in answer number 3, or actually maybe particularly answer number 4, you have to show me where this just logically isn't right. Based on the things you know and understand about, say, evolutionary theory, you know that this actually isn't even applying that principle correctly. Right? So the test, the assignment, is actually a critical thinking assignment, analyzing somebody else's work. Now, we already do that in a way because we can take students' responses. Like I can have short essays being written by students and then have them give them to anonymous copies to several other students and ask them to analyze those and give feedback. And what that's doing is it's saying that student's identifying problems with their logic, problems with their data analysis, problems with whatever type of thing that they're supposed to be writing about. Right? Those are critical analysis and thinking sort of problems. And you could do the same thing with artificial intelligence, writing things. And so it brings me all the way back to the question that I don't have an answer for, and it's really probably the question you're asking yourself when you do your next video, right? And I'm listening to your next video. How much is that really you? How much of that is you talking versus you're reading a script that was written by an artificial intelligence agent? And for now, I'm going to say that I promise that none of it will be. I think it's important that I say what I think from my general knowledge and my studying and my own research. But I don't know what will happen in the future and how that will proceed. And how my own mind will work through this process. So I'm really interested to see what the responses are to this video. And I hope that I guess why I did this was to actually stimulate people to think about this and to make them, first of all, if you didn't know about it, to make you aware. Second of all, if you were aware, to maybe give you other examples to sort of maybe think more deeply about it. And then to stimulate some kind of discussion, because I want to learn from this. And I know that I have colleagues that are interested in this topic and really are wondering themselves, like, how do we deal with the presence of this in our world? Because this is potentially a very dramatic new development in the digitization of this world. it's along with the meta universe, right, and the virtual world. Now we're conversing with computers and having them feed us information. And it's not like we're not used to being fed misinformation, but now you have, if this type of instrument becomes trusted and it becomes your trusted source, then whoever and however it's making decisions as to what it shares with you become extremely powerful, because it will influence a lot of people. And I don't have time, nor am I an expert on this, but I will tell you that I've done a number of searches on a number of different I've done a number of prompts, right? I've had a number of different discussions with ChatGPT about things like creationism, about questions about politics and so forth. And although I generally approve of almost all the responses I've gotten, I start to wonder what happens if I find that the information I'm being provided, I believe, is misinformation. How will that ever be weeded out of the system? All right. Yeah, I'm meandering now. I have no conclusion to this. I did not think about how I would wrap this up. And so I'll wrap it up just like I do a lot of things with, hey, I'm sure I'll be talking about this in the future. So till next time, talk to you later. Bye-bye.